On a bitter winter night in January 1852, everything changed. A 28-year-old man named Malachi, an enslaved worker on the sprawling Briar Ridge plantation, picked up a heavy cotton hoe. It was the same tool he had been forced to use for 15 brutal years. But on this night, he used it for something else. He used it to kill the overseer who tormented his people. Then he set fire to the great house, stood for a long breath to watch flames claw their way into the black sky, and vanished into the looming shadow of the Smoky Mountains. He carried stolen weapons and a promise he had whispered 1,000 times in the dark. He would never be enslaved again, no matter the cost, no matter who stood in his way. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Our Archive of Fear community is worldwide, and your messages help this channel grow. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We tell stories history tried to bury. 7 years. That's how long Malachi survived out there as a ghost in the hills, as a nightmare to those who once tried to own him. 7 years of raids that made planners wake sweating in candlelight. 7 years of fights and escapes so narrow they felt like curses and miracles at the same time. When a massive posse of bounty hunters and militia finally cornered him in a mountain cave in 1859, he had become something the South didn't have language for: the most feared outlaw in the southern mountains. He led a phantom-like warband of escaped slaves, free black fugitives, and desperate men who had turned their backs on the low, flat world below. They struck terror into entire counties. Plantation owners, hands trembling, offered thousands for his capture. Bounty hunters whispered his name in saloons with their backs to the wall. Down in the slave quarters across Tennessee, in whispers thinner than a thread, his name passed from mouth to mouth like a prayer. Proof that resistance wasn't just a dream. Proof that a man could refuse to be property. Proof that freedom, true, wild freedom, was worth dying for. This is the story of a 7-year war waged by one man, a man who walked away from chains and became the mountain devil they all feared. Malachi was born at Briar Ridge in 1824. His first memory was not a mother's embrace, but the splintered wood of a one-room cabin and the cry of someone else's child in the night. His parents were ghosts in his mind, sold south when he was 5. One morning he reached for his mother's hand and found only air. People in the quarters raised him after that. Old men with broken backs showed him which herbs numbed pain. Women with quiet, fierce eyes taught him how to move without being noticed, how to feed himself from the woods, how to live another day inside a world that tried to grind souls into dust. They taught him lessons you will not find in books. Never make eye contact with a man holding a whip. Read the overseer's mood before you step outside. Hide a little food. Hide your thoughts. Hide your hope. Briar Ridge was a kingdom of cruelty spread over 3,000 acres in Middle Tennessee. The Cumberland River ran like a muddy tendon along one edge. On the other stood the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains, dark and sullen like something alive. That geography mattered. In Mississippi or Alabama, escape meant endless fields and open roads where dogs could run you down. Tennessee was different. Up there, the land itself might choose sides. Tennessee was a border state, a crossroads of contradictions. Free states lay within reach if you could survive long enough. In the high places, poor white families who hated the rich planters sometimes offered help, or at least turned their faces away. The Smokies hid all kinds of runaways: soldiers who deserted, men who owed money they couldn't pay, fugitives with blood on their hands, and enslaved people who wanted a freedom the law said they could not have. The master of Briar Ridge was a man named Bartholomew Pike. At 45, he was respected, wealthy, and dead inside. He had built his fortune on the unpaid labor of 150 enslaved people. He smiled in church, shook hands with judges, and spoke about order at dinners where men drank and laughed. He was known for his clever farming tricks, his smooth ties to powerful men in Nashville, and a kind of punishment that made even other planters uneasy. He didn't just whip bodies, he whipped spirits. He didn't just hit to hurt, he hit to erase the light from a person's eyes. His overseer was Gideon Hargrove, hired in 1850 for a specialty that should have been a warning. He knew how to control difficult slaves in ways that skirted the edge of murder. He had been fired from 2 plantations after men died under his hands. To Pike, that was a recommendation. He had discipline problems. He wanted a man who would do whatever it took. From the beginning, Malachi stood out. He was over 6 feet tall and hard as old rope from years in the fields. But it was his mind that made Pike and Hargrove uneasy. He had taught himself to read in secret by watching white children stumble over letters and by stealing scraps of newspapers. He listened to conversations from shadows. He noticed how the world ran, even when the world said he had no right to understand it. He had the one thing the masters hated most: strength, intelligence, and a quiet magnetism that made other men listen. January 10th, 1852. The day the last chain broke. Gideon Hargrove beat an elderly woman named Aunt Thea in the field until she fell into the frozen mud. Her crime was the crime of old bones. Her hands were swollen, stiff with pain. She couldn't pick fast enough to satisfy a man who liked to hear his whip sing. When she fell, Hargrove announced that anyone who helped her would join her. Malachi stepped forward. No shout, no speech. He walked until he stood between Aunt Thea and Gideon's whip. He held the overseer's eyes. Let him see what lived there. Hargrove struck. Malachi caught the whip in his palm. The sound that followed was not a crack. It was a tear, a thin rip in the world everyone thought they understood. The beating that followed broke 2 of Malachi's ribs and left his head swimming. He couldn't work for 3 days. He lay on a straw pallet smelling blood and smoke and damp earth. In that silence, he learned something final. Submission would not save him. If he bowed, they would break him. If he obeyed, they would kill him anyway. He had 2 paths: die slow as property, or live fast as a free man and accept what freedom demanded. He chose the second. 10 days passed between the beating and the night when the hoe became a weapon. In those 10 days, Malachi became a different kind of man. He moved with a calm, cold purpose. He studied Hargrove's steps, where he kept keys, when he drank, when he slept. He stole an old pistol and a pouch of ammunition from a careless house servant who was too afraid to ask the wrong questions. He mapped a path into the mountains in his head, not along roads, but along dry creek beds and deer trails only the patient notice. He built a small bundle of food and tools and tucked it where no one would find it. He stopped hoping for mercy. He started building a plan. This was not a simple escape. It was a declaration. The cotton hoe felt strange that night, like something new. Hargrove slept in a small cabin behind the quarters, smug and careless. Malachi entered without a sound. The first blow dropped a man who believed he could not fall. He did not draw it out. He did not add words. He let the silence do the work. He went from there to the big house. He found the ledger books that listed people like cattle, names, ages, prices. He fed them to the fire, each page flaking into light. The fire took the curtains, then the stair, then the wall, then the house itself. He ensured Pike's women and children stumbled out alive, blind with smoke and fear. He let them live. He wasn't at war with those who had no power. He was at war with power itself. He slipped into the dark with a pistol, a knife, a rope, and a vow. He did not look back. The night opened like a mouth and swallowed him. The first 48 hours mattered most. If he could reach the steep, tangled places before dawn on the second day, he could buy time. Slave catchers would bring hounds and guns. But if the mountain accepted him, he could become very hard to find. He traveled without footprints when he could, walking in small streams, scraping past rocks where soil held no memory. He hid at noon and moved at night. He held his breath when owls watched him. He crossed ridges where the wind took your words and broke them into pieces. The mountains were both a shelter and a judge. They would keep you if you learned their rules. They would kill you if you didn't. Malachi needed new skills fast. He had to hunt and trap, but use as few shots as possible. Every bullet might be the bullet that kept him alive in a firefight. He learned to make snares for rabbits, deadfalls for larger game. He learned to tell if a creek was safe to drink by its smell and sound. He found cave mouths that were just dark lines from below, and inside them he built nests of pine boughs and small fires that smoked as little as possible. He learned when to make a fire at all. On some nights the cold crawled up inside your bones and wouldn't let go. On some nights a fire meant death because smoke would bring men with dogs. He watched the sky. He learned where storms came from. He learned which icicles lied and which stream ice would hold a man's weight. He learned when to move and when to turn to stone and become a tree. And he listened to the old, thin stream of knowledge that ran through the hills. A few Cherokee families still knew the back routes the whites never found. A few poor white mountain people hated the planters enough to hide a stranger who moved like a shadow and paid with stolen bacon and bullets. A few free black people in far hollows traded news for safety. Not friends, not allies, but people who occupied space outside the planter world, enough to make a map in his mind. In March 1852, a man stumbled into Malachi's hidden cave and nearly died at his feet. He called himself Josiah. He had escaped from a plantation where the master had marked him for sale to a Louisiana sugar place, where men dropped dead in the fields only a few years after arriving. Josiah had followed rumors like stars, rumors of a man in the mountains who fought back. He was starving. His fingers were purple with cold. He tried to speak, and no words came. Malachi gave him water, then broth, then meat. He watched Josiah's eyes. He asked no questions. Trust grew in the way a man holds himself, not in the stories he tells. When Josiah could stand by himself, they shared the fire. 2 men formed a line. Others came, months later, in 1s and 2s. A brother and sister who climbed all night and all day and fell at the door. A man with a scar from a buckle at the back of his neck. A tall woman who could track like a hound. A quiet, free black man from a river town who brought news and a rusted pistol and kept a knife hidden in his boot. A white deserter who smelled of whiskey and powder smoke and wanted to shoot something that deserved to be shot. By fall 1852, Malachi's band had a spine, 15 people at its core. Not a mob, not a crowd, a shaped thing with rules. In the mountains, Malachi said, a person's worth came from skill, loyalty, and courage. That was the only law. No man owned another. No man owed another beyond that law. Those who could not accept it left on their own or were made to leave. He trained them. He taught them to move without leaving marks, to travel where dogs hated to go, to hear danger before it was there. He taught them to fight and run at the same time. He taught them the geography like a poem. He showed them caves that connected in ways that seemed impossible, where a man could fire from one mouth and slip away through another. He placed caches of food, powder, and lead in hidden places. He turned the mountain into a net he held in his hand. They needed weapons. They took them. Slowly at first, then with more boldness. They raided small farms whose owners beat their workers. They robbed men who sold people like cattle. They ambushed slave catchers on narrow trails and took their rifles from their cold hands. They stole powder and lead from wagons moving between towns. They traded stolen goods for bullets with a man who lived alone on the far side of a ridge and hated everyone equally. The first big raid came in June 1852. Malachi led 4 fighters against a slave coffle guarded by 2 traders and a hired gun. They knew the route and the hour because Malachi's network never slept. They struck at dawn when men are slow and horses shiver. The guards died fast. 18 people walked out of that line with their wrists still raw. Some came to the mountains. Others were guided north through a chain of people who could be trusted with a whispered name and a secret sign. The South took note. The road where coffles moved had never felt so thin. Owners started sending extra guards. Some changed routes, some waited a week and prayed, and in the quarters people began chewing new ideas like tough bread. Rescue, not just escape. A fight, not just flight. Malachi's band learned and adapted. They refined their tactics. They used surprise and speed like a knife. They avoided open fights where numbers and guns could crush them. They fought only on ground they chose. They turned small forces into large ones with noise and smoke and the sudden crash of shots from 2 directions at once. They left messages sometimes, a rope tied a certain way, a circle of stones, signs only their allies could read. By the end of 1853, people in the valleys called them shadows. By the end of 1854, militia captains used curses when they spoke Malachi's name. By 1855, planters woke to find gunpowder notes nailed to their gates with cold iron nails. Your money cannot keep you safe here. The years dragged and flew. Hunger, fear, and snow. Blood and laughter at small fires, the scrape of a whetstone on a blade. The pop of a twig could mean a deer or a hunter, the refusal to die. Then came the escalation. In early 1856, Malachi decided that raids were not enough. If you want a rotten house to fall, you can chip at it. Or you can pull out the beam. It was time to pull something big. He chose Hickory Grove, one of Middle Tennessee's richest plantations. He spent 3 months collecting information. How many guards? Where the owner kept his guns? Who among the enslaved were ready to move on a single signal? He recruited 30 extra fighters for that night. He chose a moon and a wind. The raid hit like a hammer. They cut the ropes that bound people to their cabins. They broke locks and took what men kept to make them powerful. They freed more than 60 people. The owner and his 2 sons chose to fight with loaded guns in shaking hands. They died in their own front yard. Malachi's band burned the cotton gin and the main house so that the place would not rise at once like a snake with 2 heads. They left as the horizon began to pale. Behind them the sky ate smoke. The state came with fury. A militia of more than 200 men, with a famous tracker and Indian fighter named Captain Warren Hale, rode into the hills after Malachi like a flood. They had powder, guns, dogs, and maps. They had confidence. They had death in their pockets and believed they could spend it cheaply. The campaign lasted 6 months. Men hunted men across steep ridges and cold creeks. The militia fought ghosts and found ledges that went nowhere and paths that closed behind them. Malachi's band struck and vanished, always on ground that bent toward them. In July, a unit of 50 cornered Malachi in what looked like a dead-end canyon. Hale called for a rush. Horses thudded forward. Men yelled. Then rock opened its voice. The canyon walls were ladders of gunfire. The narrow mouth was a funnel for death. 17 militiamen fell. 12 lay bleeding in the dust. Malachi's band, with small losses, slid out through a slit in the rear of the canyon where children could have crawled, but horses could not. Captain Hale did not ride home. A bullet tore his life loose on a sun-bright afternoon. The man Tennessee thought could track anything lost a final argument with stone and smoke. His death broke the myth that white frontiersmen were the only ones who understood the wild. The mountain had chosen a different champion. After that, the war grew teeth. In 1857, Malachi began to attack not just people, but the bones of the plantation system. Bridges that carried cotton wagons burned in the night. Cotton gins stopped turning. Warehouses full of baled wealth smoldered into ruin. The money men who insured these buildings began to say no. The traders who walked coffles through the region went around. The cost of slavery near the mountains rose like a bad tide. Bounty hunters came in lines. Some were drunkards who shot at shadows. Some were cold men with steady eyes. The worst of them was a man called Arlen the Wolf Morrow, who had never failed to catch a person he hunted. He took a $10,000 commission to bring back Malachi's head or hands. He liked to set traps. He liked to make men panic. He wore a wolf tooth on a string. Malachi let the wolf hunt. For months he stayed just out of reach, leaving small scents and broken twigs and thin prints that led the wrong way. He learned the man's habits. He learned how he put his camp, how he left a little pile of stones to mark a trail only he could read. He learned when he slept and how. One night, when wind covered sound and the trees creaked like ships, Malachi reversed the hunt. The wolf died without a speech. 3 men who came with him lay the same way. Bounty hunters began to step carefully after that. More than 20 died between 1856 and 1858. It made good men grim. It made bad men stop and count what their lives were worth. In 1858, Malachi nailed his first public message to the charred doorframe of a burned plantation house. The words were simple and cut like a plain knife. This place was built on stolen labor from stolen people. Its destruction is justice, not crime. To those who hunt us, the mountains belong to the free. Enter and you will not leave. To those chained in sight of these hills, freedom exists. If you have the courage to claim it and the strength to defend it, come. Newspapers carried those words into parlors and parsonages. Men who never said the word slave without a smile said rebellion with a tremor. In the quarters, tired women breathed that message in like medicine. One man scratched the words into a wall with a nail until his fingers bled. But success brings weight. It slows you if you don't carry it right. As Malachi's band grew from 15 to 30 and more, security became harder. New men didn't know the rules. Some wanted to talk when silence was the only safe language. and one man, Levi, broke under a kind of pressure no one can see until it arrives. He was captured in early 1859 and traded breath for knowledge. He told the militia where to find one of the caves, how the tunnels bent, how Malachi liked to place his guards. He sold secrets to buy another day, and in the morning the sun rose on something sharp. The final siege began in March 1859. 300 militia soldiers, plus civilians hungry for a story to tell, crept up the slopes toward a cave mouth high above the valley. They brought ladders, ropes, axes, and enough powder to make smoke like winter. Officers who had read every report about Malachi, their lips moving over the words, planned to cut off every escape. They did not talk about dying. They talked about winning. Inside, maybe 20 of Malachi's best fighters loaded weapons, checked knives, and prayed or stared or swallowed hard. The cave was a living thing. It breathed when wind moved through cracks. It groaned when cold pressed on stone. The men and women inside could feel how it held them. They could feel how it might close that grip. The fight lasted 3 days. The militia tried to rush the front and found the ground unfriendly. They tried to smoke them out and choked on their own fog. Every assault cost blood. The defenders worked in pairs and threes, firing and falling back along routes they had walked until they could do it blind. Powder ran low. Lead ran low. Deep inside, 3 people sat in the dark and carved bullets out of melted buttons with shaking hands. By the second night, 13 of Malachi's fighters were dead. The rest still held the narrow places, but the weight of numbers pressed and pressed. On the morning of March 23rd, the final push came like a tide in a narrow channel. Men climbed over their own wounded, wiping blood that wasn't theirs. Bullets hit rock and sang. Shots came back, slower now, each one a choice. When the last bullet in Malachi's pistol found a target, he threw the empty gun at a man's face and drew a knife. He fought the way a man fights when he has no more space left to give. He cut 3 men down. He took a 4th with his hands. He went down after a militia lieutenant fired at close range. That man took the credit later with a smile that looked like a wound. In the quiet of a back room, he admitted to a friend that Malachi kept fighting long after most men are supposed to stop. They dragged Malachi's body into the light. They carried it down out of the mountain and put it on a table in the county seat. Public spectacle. People came by the hundreds to stare at the body of a man who had stopped sleeping when others told him to. Some spat, some cheered. Some looked at the floor and gripped their hats. Enslaved people came to see him if they could get away. They saw not a monster but a free man who died with his hands open and empty, not chained, not kneeling. He had made his choice and held it until the end. The officials told themselves a story. The state was strong. Rebellion always fails. The law is iron. But in private, some men with rings on their fingers and fat bellies did not sleep as well after that, because for 7 years one man had forced them to be afraid in their own homes. For 7 years he had made their world smaller, darker, and more honest than they wanted. The aftershock rolled on. It touched everything. Planters invested in more guards. Insurance rates climbed like vines. Traders whispered about safe routes and decided to go around the mountain country. Most of all, in the slave quarters, a different kind of story took hold. Not a dream or a hymn about sweet by and by, but the hard salt truth that one person's refusal can light a fire that refuses to go out. Some called him evil. Some called him a murderer. Down in the hollows, in cabins with no air, people called him by a different name, a man. Not property, not a shadow. A man who chose what his life would be. A man who believed freedom is a thing you defend with teeth and blood if it tries to slip out of your hands. After the siege, the militia walked the mountain paths and told the land to behave. The land said nothing. It waited. It has a long memory. History did what it always does with people who don't fit easy in books. It softened the edges and told lies to make some men comfortable. But another history moved quietly among people who do not get statues. Old men told boys about a figure in the trees who came when they needed him and vanished when they were safe. Old women told girls about a man who spoke with a knife and burned ledgers that measured human lives in dollars and neat lines. People told each other where the cave mouth lay, in case the need came again. People wrote a name in ashes where no overseer could see. The mountain kept its own record. The cave entrance is still there if you know where to look, a dark line where winter breath is colder. The ridge still breaks wind the same way. If you stand at the right point and hush, you can hear your own blood like distant thunder and understand what it meant for men to hold a narrow place for 3 days against a world that wanted them in chains. The planters were right about one thing: violence is contagious. But they never understood who caught it first. They never admitted that the system they built taught the lesson Malachi learned: submission does not save you. The lesson he left behind caught like sparks in dry grass. It blew across Tennessee and into other states and into years that had not been born yet. The war that came in 1861 broke the back of the country and opened its ribs. Men died by the tens of thousands. Papers scribbled new laws. Chains fell to the ground in some places and were replaced with chains you could not see. But among those who got free, a story lived like a coal in a hand. A mountain man who fought the law of property with the law of the knife and the truth of a match. People ask, was he a hero? Was he a villain? History never gives clean answers. It gives us people with mud on their boots and blood under their nails and prayers caught between their teeth. Malachi was not a sermon, he was a storm. He began as property. He ended as a man whose name made planters whisper and whose body made slaves lift their eyes for a heartbeat longer before bowing. In the end, the question is not whether he was right. The question is what a person will do when someone tells them their life belongs to someone else. Some kneel and survive. Some kneel and die. Some refuse to kneel and die on their feet with their hands open to the sky. Malachi's story is not safe. It is not soft. It does not let you stand at a distance and clap. It asks you to step closer and feel the heat from a house on fire. It asks you to put a hand on rough stone and know exactly how little there was between a man and a cliff. It asks you to understand that freedom is not a word. It is a choice that costs everything. And if you ever find yourself in those hills, and the wind moves the way it did on a clear night in March 1859, and you stand near a cave mouth that breathes like a sleeping beast, you may hear something that isn't quite a sound. It might be a promise. It might be a warning. It might be the last words of a man no one could own. Not again. Thank you for watching. If this story shook you, share it. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. It helps this archive of fear reach people who need to hear what the official history tried to bury. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and hit the bell. We're not done digging. There are more names down there waiting for air.